They came expecting a booming stock market, but investors here at the Moscow Exchange Forum are now trying to figure out how the latest sanctions will hit the Russian economy. The US slapped restrictions on 7 businessmen and 12 of their companies, plus 17 government officials. Some Russian investors say they're seeing the drop in prices as an opportunity to pick up shares.
We can hear the heads of our central bank, of the Ministry of Economic Development, saying that this is a good opportunity to buy them because, first of all, the government will protect those companies which are under sanctions. So there will be money spent inside Russia, and this will be good for the other companies, the ones that are not affected by sanctions.
One of the hardest hit companies is aluminium giant Rouble. It saw its stock price sink by more than 50%. The sanctions on Rouble pushed the London Metal Exchange benchmark rate for aluminium up by 1.6%. Buyers are asking who will fill the gap left by the company, which exports around 7% of the world's aluminium. The ruble has also dropped 4% against the dollar. Although the sanctions are hurting the Russian stock market, a weaker ruble is actually good for the Russian economy. It's heavily dependent on oil and gas exports. Those commodities are traded in dollars, meaning Russia gets more rubles for those sales. Before the sanctions announcement, traders on the Moscow Exchange were feeling bullish, with a number of tech and retail IPOs.
There's a lot of demand from investors, Russian and internationally, to buy new Russian companies. It's a market that was dominated for a long time by big oil and gas companies, metal companies, big state-owned banks, and now you're getting a new wave of new companies coming to the market. Very interesting for investors all around the world.
The Kremlin says it will support the sanctioned companies to help revive the market after what it believes will only be a temporary slump. That revival, though, will require investor confidence. Jack Parrock, TRT World, Moscow.
Well, let us head then live to the Russian capital because Julia Lyubova is there to give us more on this. Julia, really good to see you then. So how is Moscow responding to these sanctions? What steps are the Kremlin taking to try and minimize the effects of these restrictions?
Yes, the Russian government has vowed to take steps to minimize the impact of US sanctions. It has already said that those companies on the sanction list, they will receive government aid. And of course, exact steps of how it would help those companies are being worked on by the government headed by Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. Well, as well as those steps, the government is working on a response to sanctions. And some analysts say that this is a tricky one for the Russian government because, of course, they have to think about how to respond to those sanctions without hurting themselves. Well, one of the options, according to analysts, is to ban its titanium sales to Boeing, which come from the Avisma titanium foundry in Siberia. But of course, that will hurt Russia as well. So the government, of course, will need to think about the steps very thoroughly, and Russian response is expected to come through later this week.
So those are the options available then to the authorities. But what about investors? How are they responding to this market volatility, and in particular, the fall in the value of the ruble?
Well, indeed. Well, the ruble has fallen sharply for a second day. It has already lost about 3% of its value against the dollar. And indeed, investors are continuing an asset sell-off, fueled by fears that more US sanctions will come. Of course, this is a very worrying time for Russian business and for investors. However, the Kremlin thinks that this slump in asset values could be short-lived. Earlier today, we heard from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, and he said he expects that there will be soon a correction. Of course, it remains to be seen if this is enough to calm investors' fears.
Julia, thank you.